What's missing in Canadian conservatism?
I think there's something that has lacked in conservatism is a powerful narrative and a story and an emotional appeal. I think if you look at the way a lot of conservative politicians, even successful ones, they talk about things very rationally and very practically, and it's about this policy will work because the evidence says it will work, or this is our idea of human nature, therefore humans will interact with the world in this way, and it's all true and it's right. Um, but it lacks an emotional narrative and an emotional appeal. We also need a better story to tell about ourselves and about our nation and about why you should be conservative and why you should vote for conservatives.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Watley, and today we have Sam Duncan with us. He is VP at Wellington Advocacy. He's served as the Executive Director of Policy for Premier Doug Ford. He's worked as a senior advisor for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he's also served a number of other elected officials. Today, we had him on to discuss a fascinating article that he wrote titled Toward a Conservative Counter-Elite. He says elites inevitably exist. The question is not whether or not we have elites, but how they are formed, constrained, and empowered. So each one of those words, formed, constrained, empowered, are hot button issues. How dare you tell me that I need to be formed into anything other than I am by my own natural abilities? Who says I should be constrained? Who are you to say I should be constrained? And empowered, what does it mean to be empowered? We don't need elites to have any more power than they have already. So really a fun discussion. Sam spends his life, earns his living in this world that straddles the practical political world, retail politics, how to win elections, but also the world of ideas. So his background's in policy and advising people. And so he has a keen sense on the managerial mindset and the necessity or the need to actually deliver something that helps people, practical solutions that help people. And so how do we, as intellectual conservatives, thoughtful conservatives, people who care about ideas, how do we exist in that space between people who just want to get things done and win elections and maintain power and people who actually want to think about, well, wait a second, what are we using power for? And how do we get power? Is it legitimate to get power that way? Should we have a neutral proceduralism? So once again, I had a fantastic time. I would really love to hear what you think about this because this is about as practical as we can get. So please post a comment, hit like and subscribe, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you in the comment section. Let's get on with the show. Sam Duncan, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me this morning.
I really enjoyed your article titled Toward a Conservative Counter-Elite, and you published this in Without Diminishment. And the reason I liked your article is it attacks the problem we're facing, offers a solution, and a plan out of it. It's like a draft for a whole book. So tell us about your article. Why'd you write it?
Sure. Well, thank you. So it's something I've been thinking about for a while. So my background, I've spent a while in government, out of government, as a political staffer, as an advisor, and I think really over the last few years, I've been really reflecting upon kind of the legacy of conservative governments that we've had in this country, and kind of the role that either I played as an advisor or staffer in those, and kind of how we have failed to translate a lot of our electoral successes when we've had them, and we've struggled to have some at the national level recently, into really meaningful kind of policy, cultural change that has made long impacts into our societies. And I would say I was kind of inspired along the lines of there's a thinker that Sean, you're familiar with because you interviewed him at Civitas last year, N.S. Lyons, who has been very impactful over the last couple of years in my thinking around elites and the professional managerial class and the way our power is kind of bestowed within our institutions, and really challenging a lot of orthodoxy that I had kind of early in my career, in my life, around just allowing kind of the markets to take care of themselves and not to really engage in institutional reform, at times having a more oppositional nature to state power and institutional power. And so, it's a long way to say, it's something I've been thinking about a while, and thought that, it was time to try to kind of have a Canadian version of what we've seen in the United States with the Americans' attempt to kind of retake some of their institutions and create change. I don't think the American model works in Canada. I'm not advocating for the way the Americans adopt this, but I think their critique is right, and I think it's time for us as Canadians to start thinking about how we could look to change our institutions for the better.
Yeah, well said. So this might not be a fair question, so you can totally skip it if you want. But you mentioned NS Lions, and a point that I thought was underappreciated. And since we've mentioned, we can talk about the content at Civitas. We're not allowed to say who said what or
Yeah,
anything like
yeah,
that. But
yeah,
one point in the content that was delivered, someone mentioned the concept of Uniparty. And I think we can even say NS Lions said it because he's written about it everywhere,
yeah.
about the concept of a Uniparty. And I don't think people understood that at all. Now, if you'd rather not talk about Uniparty, that's fine. But if you feel comfortable, I wonder, can you just give me your sense of, what does Lyons mean when he says Uniparty?
Yeah, it's a really I agree. It was an underappreciated point, and it doesn't mean that there, in my view, it doesn't mean that there is an actual one party, but rather it's a way of thinking, and that the our politics really is decided over very, very small differences between political parties and political leaders. And I think you see this in Canada, especially. In fact, I'll reference an article I read in the Hub recently, that was a book review of Cass Sunstein's latest book, and talked about we're all liberals now. And really, the framework that the conservatives use and the liberals use is effectively liberalism, and that it's just variations on that. And I think that's what he's trying to say is that where there's political differences at the philosophical level, they're very, very small and almost indistinguishable between political parties. And as a conservative, it's a challenge because those institutions and those ideas are dominated by liberal elites, not conservatives, and so we're kind of playing on their terms always, and we're playing within their kind of philosophical and structural frameworks, which is a losing battle on the idea level, and I think a losing battle at the ballot box as we're not seen as being different enough. And really challenging some of the status quos that are leading to, I think, bad outcomes. When I think about Canada, I lament for Canada in a lot of ways. I see people struggling. I see cost of living issues. I see cultural challenges. I see struggles to understand what we are as a nation, and we're not going to solve those with a different form of liberalism. We need a renewed conservatism to address a lot of those structural issues.
Yeah. So I think I should just ask you all sorts of surprise questions because you answered that so well. That was really good. I like that. So small differences between the parties, essentially. And that's been my hobby horse, too. That's one of the reasons why I started this whole podcast. What is the difference between conservatism and liberalism? And not to be nerdy about these old labels. Some people call them legacy labels or archaic labels, but really to increase the bench strength, the depth of the broader non-left movement in Canada. I think we're stronger if we understand conservatism as a unique philosophy and a set of ideas that can benefit thinking on the broader non-left. Because we've always been a coalition. Anyways, now I'm turning this into a lecture. So we got to get to your article here. The first thing you said that jumped out, I'll paraphrase what you said. You said that we had the highest popular vote in 30 years, but no victory. We are, quote, yet to experience the populist success at the federal level, end quote. But you mentioned populist success, and you mentioned that other countries have experienced this. So I wonder if you could dilate on that a wee bit. And perhaps this is getting too much into retail politics, but I think that's your playground, right? This is what you're thinking about all the time. So tell us what you had in mind and what is populist success?
Yeah, look, I appreciate you picking that out. I think there's been a trend within kind of the West of the rise of these populist parties that have, in Europe, and I would say Trump, Britain, other places, they've been able to win elections. And based upon, I think, a lot of the failure of governance, failure of elites, from COVID to the fallout of the Great Recession in 08, 09, and other kind of structural issues that have caused kind of working class and kind of everyday people to feel as though the system isn't working and they need, dramatic change. And, Canada is a great example. It should be one of the greatest examples of where this institutional failure has occurred. Over the past decade, especially under the previous Justin Trudeau government. And yet, conservatives didn't win. And you had at the same time the highest voter turnout for a conservative party in 30 years. You had a leader who really understood that populist sentiment and channeled it productively into a healthy way to talk about the issues, in my view, and kept a coalition of conservatives who were maybe less populist minded kind of along. Yet we didn't win. And so thinking through, why is that the case? And how do you actually translate that real, actual frustration and disappointment that people have with the way the country is being run into uh, a greater share of the vote than we got in the last election is something that I think is necessary. We can't be, as conservatives on the right, we can't rely upon the left to split the vote to win. We have to present a theory of the case that can attract more people than we currently got to vote for us.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can do that by ignoring the populism that exists in the real frustrations and challenges facing Canadians. It's about acknowledging those and expanding upon those and finding ways to channel that into a more productive voter coalition.
Yeah. So another totally unfair question. As you're talking, you mentioned populism, and I've read just very briefly about demagoguery and demagogues. And the one definition I saw was, the prototypical demagogue is the powerful union boss who promises greater pay and greater this and greater that. Basically, the basis of his power, the whole basis of his power, it comes from promising his constituents things that they want. So he appeals to their deepest desires to bolster his power. Now, maybe I've totally ruined the definition of demagogue and demagoguery, but I haven't sorted out for myself whether or not we need a certain element of demagoguery to get elected in modern governments. And so I wonder
Yeah.
how do you sort out sort of self-interest versus a principled politics? Yeah, go ahead. Sounds like you have thoughts.
Yeah, it's I think there's something that has lacked in conservatism is a powerful narrative and a story and an emotional appeal. I think if you look at the way a lot of conservative politicians, even successful ones, they talk about things very rationally and very practically, and it's about this policy will work because the evidence says it will work, or this is our idea of human nature, therefore humans will interact with the world in this way, and it's all true and it's right, um, but it lacks an emotional narrative and an emotional appeal. And I think that's an element that we have we do to ourselves view on how we think of the world and how we don't want to we want to be rooted in what's right and what's true, and we should never get away from that, but we also need a better story to tell about ourselves and about our nation and about why you should be conservative and why you should vote for conservatives. And I think this was frankly the success of Mark Carney and the Liberals, is they had a narrative, a story. I disagree with the story, I disagree with the narrative, I think it's the wrong one, but it was real. and it went viral, and this elbows up narrative, people could understand it. It was emotional. It tapped into the emotion that Canadians were feeling at the time. And Carney took a lot of the ideas that Pierre had, and Mr. Polyev likes to remind people of that. But it wasn't about policy. It was about emotion, and it was about feeling. And this is something that we as conservatives need to understand, while doing so that avoids some of the worst base instincts that you see, in a, say, a Donald Trump like figure, right? Donald Trump understands this better than any other politician. He uses it sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. And we don't need to be like him, but we need to understand the narrative and the story and the emotional appeal, as part of our appeal to voters.
Yeah. So, with apologies, we haven't even got past the first paragraph, maybe the first three sentences of your article. So people have to read the article. It's fantastic. And as soon as you mentioned telling a better story, I was just chatting with Barry Cooper from Alberta's University of Calgary, professor emeritus, and we were talking about myth. And he said, Sean, the Central Canadians just don't understand the Western Canadian story, the Western Canadian myth. And he took a fairly strong position. He said, Sean, it's not an issue of if we separate, it's when we separate. You simply cannot build a country around such deep differences in basic stories that we tell ourselves. So I'm a politician coming to hire you as my campaign advisor. Mr. Duncan, how can I build a campaign that has a unifying myth from coast to coast to coast in two languages? Take it away. Go ahead.
Yeah, look, if I had a great answer to that, I think I'd be a much more wealthy man than I currently am today. I think about this a lot. It's and maybe I'll try to tie it into, I think, a little bit of the article in some ways. Is Canada had a myth, that unified us, which was rooted in our Britishness, right? It was rooted in our British loyalty, in part of the British Empire. And when the British Empire uh, folded and collapsed, there was a gap there in what it meant to be Canadian. We knew we weren't American. We thought we were kind of more British. It was clear that we were not as British as we thought, and due to American economic, kind of strength, we were kind of being pulled into the orbit of the Americans, much more. And we didn't. There was a gap there. There's a void in kind of our national kind of sense of who we are, our telos, right? And I think along came Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I don't like to blame everything that went wrong in Canada on Pierre Elliott Trudeau,
I,
but
I do. I do. I totally
yeah,
do.
well, there you go. Yeah, and look, and to his credit, he understood that, and I think he really filled that gap with a progressive, multicultural, post-national, form of Marxist-inspired policies, that radically changed the nature of Canada. It radically changed the nature of our leadership, our elites, our institutions. And we're still living in kind of in his world that he created here in Canada. And in doing so, it really ruptured, I think, some of the bonds that tied our nation together. Um, you look at the separation movements in Quebec and in Alberta today. There are a lot of them are over what does it mean to be a Canadian, and I don't know that we have a good answer that speaks to uniting, other than to say we're not American and we believe in this kind of post-national multiculturalism that is just very flimsy and not real. And I think most average people see that and kind of, they're taught it in school, so they know how to answer the questions when they're asked by people, but do they really understand what it means and believe it? I would say probably not. And so that's I don't have an answer. I really don't. It's a challenge. It's something that I really, I'm uh, I'm sad for Canada for, and I really hope that we can kind of reclaim that, and reclaim what it means to be a Canadian, because it would break my heart if Alberta left or if Quebec left. But at the end of the day, like, what are we going to offer them to stay? And it has to be deeper than just an economic partnership.
Yeah. So you say you're sad for Canada. I'm sad for all you consultant class and experts trying to write policy. Oh my goodness. You have a very hard job, my friend. But you mentioned Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so that's like a bit of red meat for the audience. They, at least for me, I'm like, oh yeah, let's trash on Trudeau. But he was brilliant. I mean, you got to admit. So let me read a few quotes from your piece because we're talking about elites now, and I often think of Trudeau and his tribe as uh, Father Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, as the elite of the elite, sort of the embodiment, the apotheosis of the
Mm.
professional managerial class. So you say this, quote, being merely anti-elite is insufficient, end quote. So I don't know. I don't know. Are you sure you're conservative, sir? And then you say this too, quote, elites inevitably exist. The question is not whether we have elites, but how they are formed, constrained, and empowered. End quote. And I was cheering the whole way through, but I thought, oh boy, Mr. Duncan, formed? What are you talking about formed? I was born this way. Nobody formed me. I'm self-made man. Constrained? What? You clearly didn't grow up in Alberta. And empowered by who? I'm empowered by myself. So take it away. You've just said that we're not allowed to be anti-elite. So
Yeah.
that you took away all my passion. And now you're saying I have to be formed and constrained and empowered. And so go ahead.
Yeah. Look, it's just a reality. We have people that are in charge of things. We have people that are in charge of our institutions. We have leaders. We have leadership. I think another way to describe elites are people who lead our country. And if we don't like the elite that we have, which I don't today, we should oppose them. But we can't tear them down and abandon them. That's anarchy. We need people running our institutions. And so um, by being oppositional, we should be oppositional and critical, but we need to replace the people in charge with better people. And I think um, how do we do that? I'm trying to get to the sense that we're all influenced um, by external forces. We're influenced by our education. We're influenced by our family structures, by our parents, by our friends. And I notice that a lot amongst my children. As much as I would like to think my children are, um, I just to see their development, right? The influences the external influences outside of my control that impact them, right? This is just a reality. And so when thinking about having a better elite, um, the current elite has been formed and selected and modeled in a certain way to express, I would say broadly, a liberal progressivism of managerial professionalism, and so that focuses on kind of their interests. And so how do we if we have an elite, we need an elite. How do we make that elite better? And the way to do that, I think, is to think about how we form and limit and cultivate the leaders that we have in our country. And I think that gets to the idea of being a Canadian, right? You know, there are constraints that we all have. Like, leaders should be constrained. They should be constrained towards a common good. They should be constrained towards what is in the best interest of a broad set of our community, not just their own personal interests. And we can't rely upon leaders we don't want selfish leaders. We don't want leaders that are only maximizing their own individual autonomy. That is not good for anyone. That's not good for our country. And so when talking about formation and constraint, it really speaks to the way our leaders should behave. And I think that's ultimately democratic. I think one of the ways the left has misused the term democracy is they say, everything is anti-democratic today. Conservatives are anti-democratic, but really the most anti-democratic thing is having leaders that are not connected to the people that they serve, and feel that they don't need to um, sacrifice or put others' interests ahead of their own. And so I think if we're going to have a democracy, we need to have leaders that are accountable to the interests of the people in a way that is that shows some constraint.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Good to see you smiling and getting a little excited there. That's awesome. So when you mentioned leadership though, too, the thought came to mind, and I learned this, I'm embarrassed to say the hard way, that leadership is actually something you have to learn. There's training for leadership, and I've since taken many, many courses and served, a fair bit in hospitals and in medical politics. And the old joke used to be, most doctors in hospitals, large hospitals, you know, $500 million, 500 million billion dollar operating budget. Most doctors working in those institutions think that, oh yeah, I could do the CEO job and do a better job if, I had a little more spare time. But it kind of speaks to that gut sense democratic assumption that, yeah, if I had enough votes, I could do your job better than you. And it's so wrong. We actually need training in leadership. And so this gets to your another quote I wanted to read. You say this quote, Canada's ruling class is not an accidental byproduct of markets and civil society. It is recruited, selected, trained, and reproduced through institutions. And then you go on and develop what those institutions are. So again, it sounds like, Mr. Duncan, you're speaking against some of my basic presuppositions about what it means to be a good prairie populist, self-made, independently successful person. You're saying I have to be selected. Oh, I don't like that word. So tell me, how come you haven't been had eggs thrown at you yet? Selected, trained, reproduced through institutions. Take it away.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a certainly a very important strain of kind of um, entrepreneurial individualism that I think is important when it comes to the economic sphere and starting businesses and being very kind of like autonomous in how you operate within the free choice of making with your labor. I would say I'm talking pretty narrowly around cultural institutions, universities, bureaucracies, kind of the professional managerial class of folks that set the rules for our country, that set the parameters, that our judicial system, other areas that kind of govern and run our society. And in that way, very much that people are selected. I experienced this in my university. I was a conservative at a university in Canada, so it was very evident that I did not fit in. I was not selected. My professors had very different views than I did. It was very obvious, even as a conservative, that if you spoke a certain way as a conservative, you would be accepted by. Um, you were not a threat. You were accepted by the institutions, and very much language is coded like that. I think that's a big reason you see, on the progressive side, some of the ways they've manipulated language is it's elite coded language for selection, right? So it's to say, are you going to use these pronouns or these words that it sends a signal that you're one of them and that you can move along in the system, and if you don't, you're not brought in. And so I think this is I see it too amongst people that I know that are conservative and they go work in an organization, and a couple years later, they've been changed by the people around them. It's hard to be the only conservative in a liberal dominated world, and if you want to succeed in a lot of these institutions, you kind of have to play their game. I think it was Breitbart who said this, but any organization that is not inherently right wing becomes left wing, and I think there's some truth to that. And so I would say, to the folks that are a little bit more libertarian minded, I'm not, this is not state control over the economy, but this is rather, how do we create a space that isn't that has some competition, and some ability for people that don't want to espouse the political ideology of the progressive left to hold positions of authority and power in our country, to better shape and form our citizens towards better policy outcomes that they would agree with and look to achieve.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'll get a little bit nerdy on you. That happens to be one of my favorite lines about the if you aren't explicitly right wing, you'll drift left wing over time. And actually, you can double check me on this. Fact checks, so someone will fact check us. I'm pretty sure it's Robert Conquest, who
Oh,
is
it is.
a
Okay.
yeah, he's a historian, American historian. He had three laws, and I can't remember all of them, but that one's my favorite. The other one is if you ever want to understand an organization, just think of it as being governed by a gang or a group of its enemies. Anyways, Conquest laws. We'll put a link
Conquest
to
law.
it. Yeah, Robert Conquest, rule number two, I believe it was. But you mentioned, yeah, I'm glad you called out the entrepreneurial naivety, right? Ignorance. Matt Spoke said, you know what? There's nothing like being ignorant for tackling a job. You had no idea how big it was and you had no idea how to solve it, but you go out and you solve it and you build a company and it becomes successful. Of course, with that success comes about 100 other failures before you get that success. But yeah, we shouldn't minimize that youthful, passionate ignorance that allows us to go tackle things. And we shouldn't confuse that with, well, I'm going to take that same attitude of youthful ignorance. I don't need to read anything or know anything, and I'm going to lead the country. Uh, yeah, that worries me. But I'm going to push ahead. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you talk about from there. You mentioned Anthony Kosh's comment about we can't outcompete charter liberalism with incrementalism and tax credits. And so then you say we need to have cultural leadership, long march through the institutions, and we can promote the fact that Canada is a resource-based country, but we also need identity. We need strong families. We need strong communities. And so take us through that jump. We can't outcompete charter liberalism with policy tweaks. And to your background in policy, my background in policy, I think, yeah, no, give me a chance. I'll come up with a policy. But I've learned the hard way. Yeah, no, there's usually not a policy that you can come up with. So instead, you're saying we actually need a bigger vision that really starts from first principles. At least that's how I'm reading you. Tell me if I've got that right and explain what you mean.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's more to think about governing as as a longer term agenda to reshape the way we interact, way Canadians interact with their government. And I think from my standpoint, there's finding ways that we can strengthen other kind of institutions that can kind of constrain the authority of the state, or of other powerful kind of actors in our institutional culture. And so, like for me, it starts with the family. I think there's a very big reason why the family has been under assault from the progressive left for over 100 years. It is, in my view, the most important institution we have. And it starts with empowering families and parents to have more choices and the ability to raise their children how they would like in the ways they would like, and to understand too at a level of um, importance. There's a lot of issues that we have in our society that stem from kind of breakdowns of family policy. In my view, we've got declining birth rates. We're having marriages formed later in life, if at all. Um, you know, uh, Challenges in the education space. There's a number of issues, and so to think about how do we strengthen the family, how do we strengthen that as an institution, I think, and being okay to talk about that. I think conservatives have been really worried about talking about that. It hasn't in the past been coded kind of towards negative connotations or divisive social issues that have existed in our society. But I'm trying to say we need to reclaim that space and not be afraid to talk about something that we all know is true, the importance of the family. I think one of the challenges we have, just at a practical level, is in our failure to do so. A lot of people don't actually understand the importance of the family philosophical level. There's a reason why these public daycare programs that the liberals put out are so popular, right? People want that. People are looking to offload the responsibility of raising their children onto the state, for institutionalized daycare, and for in Ontario here we have all day junior kindergarten, which is another form of institutionalized care for children, and those are very popular, and they're popular for a reason. And I want to kind of try to combat those issues, and unpack them and say, why are they popular, and can we offer alternatives to parents and to families that will empower and make it easier for families to want to be more parents to be more involved in kind of the cultivation and raising of their children. Are there economic barriers that are preventing these choices from being made? And I'm not saying we should not take the approach of forcing people to make choices they don't want to do. I'm trying to say we need to make it so that people want to choose the choices that we think lead to a more flourishing and productive society. And so to think through it at a first principles level and a deeper level, and to try to have conversations that are going to be longer term. Like, these will not be fixed by one leader or one political party, but I think it's a duty of conservatives to think longer term about how do we combat some of these challenges, because they're pretty fundamental to, I think, the long term thriving of our population.
Yeah. You're sounding like Stanley Baldwin. They called the interwar years between World War One and World War Two in Britain the Baldwin era. And I don't know if you've heard me talk with Dan Pitt about it on a previous episode. And one of the concepts that they looked at, there was kind of a back to first principles era in conservatism, in British conservatism, in that interwar period. And one of the terms that came out of that was the concept of a property owning democracy.
Mm.
And they wanted people to own property because owning property shaped the individual. You had to be thoughtful, self-reliant, resourceful, practical, disciplined. And we can see the same kind of concept when we talk about families. We're not talking about families simply because it's better economically and you have more people under one roof. Yeah, you could make that argument too, but we're really talking about formation of truly free people. So a free and ordered society requires that formation in character that happens within a family. And we see how disadvantaged people are when they haven't had that opportunity to grow up in traditional families. And we've been so nervous. Oh, I don't want to offend the much smaller proportion of society who either doesn't have access to that or thinks it's normal to not have a traditional family. I think we need to stop being sheepish about it, and we need to actually push ahead to your point and say, this is a robust vision on what we want. So I'll just end with one last comment on this. I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at the Massey Commission. I didn't even know what it was. You probably do. You probably learned about it at university. But in between 1948 and 1951 in Canada, Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, a liberal prime minister right after the war, his party said, we're really worried about propaganda. Our country folk, our citizens, are being told silly things, toxic things, things that can destroy the fabric of our society and our country. And so they undertook a very large commission to look at arts, education, culture, family, everything, like literally top to bottom. And Vincent Massey was the head of that. And a friend of mine said, well, Sean, usually when they do that kind of thing, it's already a sign that the whole project is dying anyways. But what you're talking about, I couldn't help thinking, it almost sounds like you're saying we are in a crisis moment again. We almost need that back to roots. What are the foundations that we need to shore up that are essentials for a thriving country? Now, have I just tried to turn you into a liberal prime minister here, or would you agree with that sentiment? Maybe you've never even heard of Massey, and so I'm not.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm vaguely familiar with his commission. I think that would be interesting to see how that conversation would occur today. I think, looking back on the Canada of Louis Saint Laurent, you had much more of a monoculture, right? And so you would the the opportunities for it to be hijacked by individual grievances or NGO groups or ethnic diasporas. I think today it would be very challenging to have the same type of look. Maybe I'm getting more cynical about the approach we can take on some of these things, but um, I think we should be. I think we should have. I think it'd be hard for the state to do that today for those reasons. Like I think it would end up being hijacked by other interests. But this is the type of thing that I'd love to see, think tanks in Canada work on, or universities if they have. There should be other groups out there that are thinking like this and putting in work and research into this type of work. And that's kind of what I'm calling for is I think the role we can play as conservatives is to try to fund and create some additional institutions that can maybe do some of this work for us. I look to the United States where they've just got such a robust network of institutions and think tanks and some of them good, some of them bad. But there's just so much depth of talent and ability to think about these things. Where in Canada we just simply don't. And I think one of the challenges is a lot of those in the states are philanthropic enterprises that the wealth in the United States can fund. We don't really have the same kind of network of people that are interested in giving like that here. So we could take I think a playbook out of Pierre Elliott Trudeau when he created the IRPP with a government grant. And create our own through an endowment that is insulated from future governments and future political decisions, and give it a mandate and staff it with people that we think align broadly with those interests, and try to create institutions that can generate those ideas, that could do a study like that and get it out there in the public, and try to convince people that these are worthwhile initiatives. I think we can't rely upon conservative politicians to be leaders in these areas. They're always going to try to follow the voters. We need to find institutions that can push the voters to push the politicians um, to think like this.
Yeah. So you read my mind, and I'm glad you kind of shared your skepticism about the Massey Commission because I share your skepticism as well. I think that's a starting point for all conservatives. I don't know, sounds pretty big governmenty to me, and and yet at the same time, I labeled all your points in your article. I got from A, B, C, D, E all the way to K. So you
Yeah,
have a long list of really practical suggestions, which was great. And if I maintain that same skepticism, you said, build coalitions, reform universities, and the endowments, reform the senior public service. And I was going, yes, yes, yes. But then part of me was saying, okay, well, and this has been always the problem with conservatives from the start. We say, well, if we reform, someone else is going to reform, and
yeah,
they'll reverse our reforms and make them even worse. So maybe I'll
yeah,
just pause on that comment of skepticism. I have another comment, but I wonder what you thought about
yeah.
if we do it, they'll just reverse it.
Well, look, I share that sentiment. Look, they're doing it. I think this is the thing that we need to understand. They do this every single day with every single decision they make in the government, and they're not stopping. And so it's great to say, well, we shouldn't even try. Like, why should we try? Like, we're just ceding that ground to them. And so I would argue that hasn't worked. It is not a winning strategy. However, I do think it's very important, and this is something that I always like to think about when I advised politicians was when making a reform, think about how your most feared opponent would use this authority, right? And so I do think we need to be mindful of that. I think this is where you see huge mistakes in the Trump administration with what he's doing. Um, that when the Democrats get into power, they are going to use everything he's done against his people in 10x, right? And so I think it's unwise to take that approach. I also think it's unwise to do nothing. And so this is some nuance and some skill, but I think it's how do you reform institutions in a way that is long lasting. And I think that makes them by making them work well and competent and exceptional, and by finding the right people that people like the changes that have been made, and they're popular and they're broadly supported. And I think that is feasible, and that is possible. I think about, I live in Toronto. There's a lot of infrastructure challenges in Toronto. I think this is an example. If at the end of the day, and I don't blame the politicians here, um, but if we had a better running public transit system, and it was based upon removing DEI hires and making some institutional changes to the types of structures in place and how they fund infrastructure, and you can get into the minutia of it, and it's kind of coded conservative. I think that's the people would love that. They just want things to work better. I actually think this is some of the success Ron DeSantis has had in Florida, where he's made a lot of changes, and they're very popular because they made the state work better. And people are like, yeah, I just kind of like things working better. And so where we make some of these changes and these reforms, they have to align with a practical reality of making the lives of people better. And that makes it so much harder for the left to come in and undo what we're doing if it works. Now, I would say Justin Trudeau did a great job of that at the federal level, taking a lot of things that did work and break them. Um, but it took him 10 years to do so. And so you're never going to avoid that. But I think they have to be rooted in that. And you have to think, how would my opponent use this authority against me, and be mindful of that, and be thoughtful with how you make changes.
Yeah, that's really wise advice. As you were chatting, I scribbled down success is the best revenge. And I don't know
Yeah.
if that really
Yeah.
applies to policy, but to your point, if you can demonstrate practical success that improves people's lives. Now the problem is a lot of people will forget how good they had it under Prime Minister Stephen Harper or
Yeah.
whatever. But the the presupposition though of your whole set of advice, especially that you just summarized there right now, the presupposition is based on the notion that we're not simply pursuing a neutral proceduralism, a
Hmm.
fair play, that there isn't a rule book that we're going to follow and everybody else is going to follow and everything's going to work out great. Instead, politics is about contest and some degree of conflict. George Grant, actually, I was just reading this. He said that conflict and even uh, international conflict is always on the horizon of the of politics. We don't want it. That's part of the reason why we pursue it is to avoid conflict, to avoid fundamental unrest. But we have to admit that it's on the horizon. Now, that's not to say that we're talking about a Carl Schmittian friend enemy. We're just here to crush everybody else. No, but it would be naive to say that we aren't often talking about very different first principles. And that's something that, getting back to Lyon's comment on the Uniparty, that's something that a lot of people don't even want to talk about. They say, no, no, it's just let's follow the rules, follow the procedures, and look where that's got us, right? We actually need to have a vision, like you're saying. You can make a comment, and then I was going to attack you once more on your suggestions. Go ahead.
Please attack me. Yeah, look, I think that's right. Like I think we kind of view these things as being neutral, right? Nothing's neutral. Everything has an agenda, or an outcome that it's looking to achieve. And I think the idea that we can just rely upon um, proceduralism to reflect proceduralism based upon a liberal progressive ideology, and it's not going to turn out well for conservatives. It
No.
just won't. And so either we can contest that, or we can stop. And then we need to stop complaining. Either we contest it or stop complaining, because those are the two options I see
Yeah.
before us.
Yeah. I like that. Stop complaining. Sounds like you have kids. So, so the other thing I wanted to attack you on, and it's not an attack, I'm
Yeah,
joking, obviously, but
yeah.
a lot of the things that you're calling on for us to do, the Conservative Party should show that they have, quote, a team of elites
Mm,
capable of, et
hmm.
cetera, reforming universities, appointments, counter elite, develop a counter elite, not a grievance based narrative, a solutions oriented vision. And it seems, again, like one of the presuppositions coming through a lot of this, I tend to agree with it, but it's not the first thing you think of when you think of people in the broader conservative political movement. You're asking us to think. You're asking us to become nerds and intellectual types. And
Yeah.
so you've got a nice bookshelf there, and I buy more books than I'll ever read before I die. And so that's not a rugged pioneering individualism. And so are you asking us to do something that is ego dystonic? You know, it goes against who we are as conservatives.
So, I think my friends who are campaigners often tell me this. There's a place for ideas and there's a place for policy, but we got to win. We got to win first, and winning is all that matters. And if you can't win, you can't get any of your ideas in place. And to them, I like to say we're talking about two different things. I'm really trying to separate the ideas and uh, the the policy from the political parties and the politicians themselves. I think talking about trying to create an ecosystem and a environment where when politicians do win, they feel some pressure to act and make the changes required to make tough changes and requirements to policies and to issues. I'm not naive to think that unless there is some sort of political benefit and constituency that is pressuring politicians to act, they won't make those changes, conservative ones, right? And so what I'm trying to say, we're talking about different things. Like to my friends on the campaigning side, for me, it's about when you win, what are you going to do with it, and how are you gonna make those changes? But there needs to be work done to push politicians. To feel like they need to make those changes. Otherwise, they're not going to. And they're right to push back when they say, I wasn't elected to do this. Um, and it's not popular. And so I'm trying to think about how do we as a conservative movement broadly make it so that politicians want to reflect some of these bigger changes and these bigger issues in their governance and try to make the argument that it is actually in your interest to campaign on some of this stuff, and it is actually in your interest to have these conversations with people, and they need to be, I think, rooted in some form of um, uh, you know bigger picture thinking, as opposed to just being kind of transactional and consistent, and to try to push the conservative movement kind of in this direction.
I'm scribbling things down as you talk. And one of the analogies I often use, having been involved with several large takeovers, coups, whatever you want to call it, you know, when something's really dysfunctional, you just have to go in and try to change things. And there's a different sort of individual that will help you to storm the gates than the individual you need to deal with the new administrative state. And so you need someone who's willing to go in and break stuff, but then you also need a very different kind of individual who's comfortable saying, "Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to reflect, and I'm going to start
Hmm.
building that ecosystem." I like that word. And that's a very different kind of person. It's a different way of thinking. And it requires a lot of work and skill. Storming the gates you can do with just muscle and energy and spending money, spending time. But when you actually get inside and you're rebuilding something from the ground up, that takes, wow, that's a different person. And so my second last question for you is, so often it seems like once we get in power, which doesn't happen as often as I'd like, but once conservatives get in power, they tend to want to manage like right-wing liberals. So they assume the environmental presupposition of managerialism.
Hmm.
Life is better if we have managers, and there's nothing that managers can't make better. And so we need to expand management everywhere and in every nook and cranny of our country that we can. And so the more policy ideas you come up with, especially if they're successful, we talked about success. Success is great. Come up with a policy, then boy, oh boy, we're going to give you a promotion, Mr. Duncan. And that's been my world too, right? In health policy, come up with a
Hmm.
great idea.
Hmm.
Look how much money we save. Look how wait times drop. And however, at our core, we are assuming the same starting point, the same presupposition of managerialism. It's just a right-wing managerialism. So Mr. Policy Wonk, tell me why you should be out of work and not be a policy guy.
Yeah, you know what? This is something that I will admit, even in my time in governments, I bought into. I bought into the managerialism, and I think it's because I was formed uh, through my experiences in university, and then early in my career as in government to just be this is the way that things get done, and you know to focus on the management of things and the reporting and the accountability that's required, which are all in and of themselves very important things to have. um, I really think for me, what really broke um, my or was the moment for me that I really had the first break was around COVID, and just seeing how the managerialism of COVID suppressed the truth in a lot of ways, the lived reality that we are all kind of experiencing, and the control that we had, and not to go down that rabbit hole, but it was more of like, well, there's other things at play here than just kind of ceding control to kind of the managers, because this isn't kind of working, and then to kind of try to challenge some of those ways of doing things. Like, look, this is going to be this will be the fundamental challenge, and I think that's why it's important to focus on how conservatives think about the public service, because I do think the public service is a really important institution. I've got a lot of respect for the public servants I've worked with over the years. Some of the smartest, most competent, capable people who are just trying to do good for their country. It's created a system, but it's created a system of inefficiencies and bureaucracy and veto points and managers for the sake of managers. And so how do we like, we need kind of a theory of the case for public service renewal as conservatives that isn't blow the thing up and fire all the bureaucrats. But it's like, how do we change the way decisions are made? How do we change some of the the frames that are used? One idea I had in government that never saw the light of day, so I'll talk about my failure here, was to create a family lens for policies that go through in the Ontario government, to say, how does this policy impact the family, and kind of
Mhm.
use the managerialism to force it to identify and create a frame of how will this policy impact families. Um, we do that for all kinds of other groups. So why don't we do it for things like that? So I think we can be creative about how we look at these institutions and reform them, but I think we need a case of public service reform, uh, and in a way that isn't entirely disruptive. There's a lot of good people in this country that are public servants, and I think want to see better outcomes. And so this is the real challenge.
Yeah. I'm glad you agree with me that it's a challenge because all I can share are my failures. So yeah, we could spend a whole hour just talking about managerialism and the different kinds of public organizations that are more suited to managerialism. So, James Q. Wilson's famous book, Bureaucracy, talks about four different kinds of organizations. And if you're thinking of a production organization, like the post office would be the prototypical example, where you can see the work being done and you can see the outcome of the work being done, then that really lends itself to a managerialized approach where we have a spreadsheet and a budget and KPIs, and we have direct lines of reporting and a rigid organizational structure, et cetera, all this managerial talk. However, when you talk about a craft organization, so someone who's going to do a labor negotiation for you, you have no idea what's going on in the room. All you see is the outcome. Here's a good outcome, or here's not a good outcome. Or when you talk about education or police officers, I usually talk police officers, education, and healthcare. So when you tell a police officer, I often tell my cop friends, I say, so you're an officer of the peace. What does it mean to go out and keep the peace? And do you get paid more if you keep more peace? And what does that look like? And how do
Right.
we measure how much peace you have kept? And so Wilson makes the point that often you can't describe what is being done, and you can't even describe the outcome. So in education, well, did the student pass the test because their mom taught them, or they learned from their friend, or they already knew it before they started the course? And do they even remember it 20 years later? So when you start talking about different kinds of institutions, organizational types within this broader ambit of public service, we have to have the humility, I think, to admit that our traditional approach to managerialism that we all learn in school or in leadership training doesn't apply when you have different kinds of situations like peacekeeping, patient care, and that sort of thing. And so it's the failure of implementation that has humbled me to say, oh, okay, wait a second. Actually, the most important thing in this room is how much the person who's implementing the policy that I think I've controlled and designed, it actually matters more what they think about my policy
Yeah.
than the actual design of the policy.
Yeah.
Because even if it's a terrible design, but they're passionate about the outcome, they'll deliver the outcome and they'll make up for my silliness that I put on
Yeah.
paper, or they can destroy my beautiful design. So, uh, anyways, I'm getting too excited here. You're welcome to make a comment, and then I have one last question.
Yeah, look, I think that's very wise to think about it in that way. And I think a lot about our, for me, education comes to mind where, you can have the greatest curriculum in the history of curriculums, but really it matters is how are teachers individually teaching the kids in the classroom every single day. And that's what matters. And so it's, I think that's just a parallel to what you're saying.
Yeah, for sure. So, what should I have asked you about? What did I miss?
I don't know that you missed anything, Sean. This has been a great conversation. I would say uh, I'm glad you pushed me on some of the use of the state. I think I think this is an area where I get a lot of pushback from people is it's not our job as conservatives to use state power to achieve outcomes we're seeking. That's Marxism. That's progressivism. That is not the rugged individualism of the prairie populism, right? And so that's the one area that I think I kind of welcome that debate, and I think that's a really vibrant one in kind of Canadian conservatism today, and I think it's very generational. I think maybe the other thing is just I think there's a big generational lens on even how I've kind of presented some of these issues and these ideas is I've seen a lot more receptivity from people under the age of 40 than people over the age of 40. And that's something that I think is really really encouraging kind of within kind of the conservative movement broadly is I think a lot of younger people I'm almost 40 so I'm kind of on the top end of this but are just seeing that like things that haven't worked. The
Mm.
they're really living with the real negative manifestations of progressive managerialism and really questioning it. And I think a lot of older people are who have benefited from a lot of these things individually are less likely to look for radical change. I think they view
Mm.
radical change as disruptive to them. And so this kind of generational flank within Canada and within conservatism, I think is um, is something that's really interesting. It's why I've been really, appreciative of your podcast and the folks that you have on. I give you a lot of credit. You're trying to give platforms for some of the younger voices within Canadian conservatism, and I think that's just very important right now as we look to kind of have some of these conversations and hopefully an agenda that can help a conservative leader, hopefully Mr. Polyev, become the next prime minister of Canada.
Yeah, well said. I love that. And I should just be quiet and end the show there, but I have to agree with you in the sense, I don't know if I'd use the word radical, I would say fundamental. So
Mm.
all healthy, okay, I'm really going to nerd out on you here now. So I've just been reading Paul Gottfried. He said he said this. This is on page 154 of his The Essentials book. He said, according to Aristotle, the creation and maintenance of regimes depend on tropos, a disposition and orientation that allows them to take root and flourish among particular populations. Not every regime is suited to every culture. When the needed disposition disappears, the corresponding regime will disintegrate. End quote. And so what I see amongst yourself and a lot of the, shall we say, under 40s is they're saying, hello, guys, the culture has changed and you're still depending on the assumptions of good faith, and Canadians are polite and they'll all stand in line and they'll all be honest on their taxes and they'll join the public service and do what's right. Public choice theory doesn't exist. They would never do something for their own selfish ends. And the younger cohort is saying, guys, get your head out of the sand. Yeah, public choice theory exists and this needs to be fundamentally changed. And there's no such thing as neutral proceduralism. And we need to talk about telos and we need to talk about tropos. And so I see, yeah, you could call that radical. It probably does sound radical to people of a certain vintage. Or a certain era. That's a better way. Certain era, or certain mindset. That's even more polite. But I think this has been the reality of every generation, every era has to rediscover the roots of its society or it can't grow. So again, I start preaching at you. I
That's well
apologize. I
said.
get
It's
all
well said,
excited.
Sean. Well said.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking time.
Yeah, of course.